The November wind cut across Willow Springs Cemetery like a dull blade stirring the frost-brittle grass around the fresh graves that dotted the hillside behind St. Matthew's Church. 10-year-old Abigail Hart knelt beside the newest mound of earth, her small fingers wrapped around a dented tin cup that held a piece of cornbread with a single candle flickering against the Dakota Territory's cruel gusts. "Happy birthday, Mama," she whispered to the wooden cross that bore her mother's name in simple carved letters. "I know you can't eat it, but I made it with honey like you taught me." Mrs. Chilton gave me the honey. The flame danced precariously in the wind wax, dripping onto the bread that had already grown cold in the bitter air. 3 days had passed since Ruth Hart's burial. 3 days since Doc Morrison had signed the death certificate, claiming fever had taken the hard-working laundress. But something gnawed at Abby's mind, like a persistent ache. Her mother had been humming Tuesday morning while preparing breakfast, and by Wednesday evening she lay cold and still, her body already prepared for the ground before Abby had even been allowed to say goodbye. The sound of approaching horses cut through her grief with the sharp clarity of breaking glass. 2 riders emerged from the gray afternoon, their mounts breathing vapor clouds in the frigid air. Abby recognized them immediately and felt her stomach clench with fear. Vern Pike, Barlo Creed's mine foreman, sat his black gelding with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to intimidating others, while behind him rode Tom Bracken, younger and meaner, with pale eyes that seemed to find amusement in other people's misery. "Well, looky here," Pike drawled, his voice carrying satisfaction that made Abby's skin crawl. "Little Missy's playing graveyard tea party. Matron Shaw said we'd find you moonin' around here." Abby scrambled to her feet, clutching the tin cup to her chest like armor. She knew these men worked for Barlo Creed, who owned the silver mine that dominated the eastern ridge above Willow Springs. She also knew that in the Dakota Territory of 1881, orphan children often found themselves bound to institutions like the Shaw Home for Foundlings, places where young hands earned their keep through long hours of washing and cooking for minimal food and shelter. "A time to quit this foolishness," Bracken said, dismounting with predatory grace. His spurs jingled as he approached across the frozen ground. "Can't have you running wild as a Mustang. Shaw's got good Christian work waitin' and you're burning daylight." "I ain't running wild," Abby replied, backing toward her mother's grave. The wooden cross pressed against her legs, solid and reassuring. "Mrs. Chilton said I could stay at her place till..." "Till what?" Pike's harsh laughter cut her off like a whip crack. "Till some fool family takes shine to a half-breed whelp girl. Your ma's troubles went to ground with her, but her debts are still breathin'." The cruel words hit Abby like physical blows, each one designed to wound and humiliate. She'd heard whispers about her darker skin and hair, seen the way some townspeople looked at her with speculation and judgment. But her mother had always told her to pay no mind to ignorant talk. "Mama didn't owe nobody nothing," she said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. "Maybe not coin." Pike replied, his scarred face twisting into something resembling a smile. "But respect's a different currency altogether. Your ma was getting too big for her britches, spreading tales about her betters. Lucky the fever took her 'fore she could cause real mischief." A new voice cut through the cold air like tempered steel. "Child ain't going nowhere." All 3 turned to see a man step out from behind a weathered headstone, moving with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. He was perhaps 35 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with long black hair tied back with leather cord and skin weathered by sun and wind. A Lakota warrior, though he wore the clothes of a white man, dark wool trousers, a heavy cotton shirt, and a leather vest that couldn't quite conceal the Spencer carbine rifle he carried with practiced ease. Most noticeable was the careful way he held his right shoulder, suggesting an old injury that still caused him pain. Makya, for that was his name, meaning eagle hunter. In the language of his people, had been watching from the tree line when he heard voices raised in anger. He knew Ruth Hart and her daughter from the times he'd guided them to the river, where Ruth did her washing. "This ain't your put-in, redskin." Pike snarled his hand, drifting toward the pistol on his hip. "Girls bound for Shaw's place, legal and proper." "Show me the papers." "Don't need to show Jack to no blanket Indian." Bracken spat, though his bravado carried a tremor of uncertainty. The Spencer's barrel shifted almost imperceptibly in Bracken's direction. "Then you got no claim here." Pike's fingers closed around his gun grip, and the air between the men crackled with the tension of imminent violence. Abby pressed herself against her mother's grave marker, still clutching the tin cup with its dying candle, watching these three men decide her fate with weapons and harsh words. The confrontation erupted with sudden, brutal clarity. Pike drew first steel-clearing leather with practiced speed, but Makya had been expecting it. The Spencer thundered like God's own judgment, and Pike's horse reared with a scream of agony as the heavy bullet shattered its shoulder. Pike tumbled backward into the frost-hard earth curses flying from his lips as he fought to bring his pistol to bear, while his wounded mount thrashed in the dirt. Bracken's iron appeared a heartbeat later, but Makya was already ghost-stepping between the headstones, diving behind a tall granite monument as lead buzzed through the space where he'd been standing. "Abby." Makya's voice cut through the gunfire like an axe through timber. "Creek now." The girl didn't waste time thinking frontier life had taught her that hesitation was often the difference between breathing and bleeding out. She dropped the tin cup and ran toward the cottonwoods, her small boots slipping on the icy ground as she scrambled for cover. Makya's rifle spoke again, muzzle flash lighting up his face like devil's fire. But pain shot through his wounded shoulder, throwing off his aim, the old cavalry bullet, choosing this moment to remind him of its presence. Pike was back on his feet, his dying horse behind him, gun steady despite his tumble. "Gut shoot the savage," he screamed, spittle flying. "Don't let the bastard reach water." But Makya was already moving long legs, carrying him between the markers, while his shoulders sent lightning bolts of agony down his arm. Behind him, Pike and Bracken gave chase, their boots drumming against the frozen ground like war drums calling for blood. The creek ran shallow, but swift, winter cold, and sharp with floating ice. When Abby waded in, she gasped like she'd been stabbed, nearly losing her footing on the treacherous stones. "Can't swim," she called back, terror making her voice thin as wire. "Grab my belt," Makya replied, checking their back trail. "Whatever you do, don't turn loose." Abby's thin arms circled his waist as they entered deeper water. The current was meaner than it looked, trying to sweep them both downstream toward the rapids that would dash them against the rocks below town. His busted shoulder made it near impossible to balance, and more than once they almost went under together. A gunshot cracked from behind them, and a bullet kissed the water near Abby's head with a vicious little splash. Pike had reached the creek's edge and was drawing a bead for his second try. Then another shot rang out, not from Pike's position, but from the opposite bank. Mary Chilton stood among the cottonwoods with a double-barreled shotgun in her capable hands, having heard the gunfire from 6 blocks away, and come running. "That'll be far enough, boys," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen her share of trouble. Her first barrel sent Pike diving for cover behind a fallen log, while her second made Bracken think twice about testing the water himself. "This way." Mary gestured toward higher ground. "Move your stumps." They made it to shore with Makya collapsing on the muddy bank, his shirt dark with creek water and fresh blood where his old wound had opened like a flower, blooming in reverse. Mary Chilton's boarding house stood on 2nd Street, like a lighthouse in a storm, its clean lines and honest construction speaking to the character of the woman who'd built it from nothing but determination and sweat equity. 2 stories of solid timber and good intentions, with windows that caught the morning light and rooms that stayed warm even when the Dakota wind tried its best to freeze everything solid. Mary herself was a practical woman of 34 winters, with graying brown hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun and hands that showed the honest calluses of hard work. She'd come west after Antietam took her husband along with 60,000 other boys who'd never see home again, bringing nothing but grit and a small inheritance that she'd parlayed into respectability. When Makya appeared at her kitchen door near midnight with a half-drowned, scared child in tow, Mary didn't waste breath on fool questions. The frontier had taught her that survival meant helping first and interrogating later. "Like, get inside 'fore you both freeze to jerky," she said, ushering them into her warm kitchen where a fire crackled in the cast-iron stove. "Abby, child, you look like a drowned cat. Let's get you sorted before pneumonia finishes what those fools started." While Mary tended to the girl with gentle efficiency, Makya settled heavily into a kitchen chair, his shirt painted with blood and river water. The old bullet wound in his shoulder gift from a cavalry patrol that had tried to relocate his band 3 summers past had torn open during their escape. "How bad you figure?" Mary asked, having wrapped Abby in warm blankets and set her by the stove with hot coffee. "Bad enough," Makya admitted, wincing as she began cutting away his blood-soaked shirt. "Shoulder ain't been right since the blue coats put lead in it. Gets ornery when I ask too much." Mary examined the wound with steady hands that had closed worse tears in flesh. The old scar tissue had split clean along its weakest point, opening a gash that would need proper tending before corruption set in. "You were fortunate the first time, missed the big vessels. Looks like luck's holding." As she worked cleaning and stitching with the competence of someone who'd patched plenty of frontier wounds, Makya told her about the cemetery confrontation. How Pike and Bracken had come for Abby with no legal papers, just creeds say-so, and the assumption that might made right in territories where law was thin as morning mist. They mentioned Shaw by name. Mary asked her needle drawing torn flesh together with careful precision. Said she was expecting the girl. Made it sound like business already struck. Mary's expression darkened like storm clouds piling up over the Badlands. Shaw's place turns a fine profit off children's backs. Washing, cooking, cleaning for the mine crews and mill hands. Keeps Creed's costs down while putting on Christian airs. A sharp knock interrupted their conversation, official and demanding in the quiet night. Mary answered to find Deputy Emmett Rusk on her porch hat in hand and snow melting on his coat shoulders. He was young, barely shed of his milk teeth, Mary thought, but his eyes held honesty that seemed genuine in a town where that quality was scarcer than hen's teeth. "Evening, Mrs. Chilton," he said, touching his hat brim with practiced politeness. "Heard tell there might have been some excitement tonight." His gaze found Makya at the kitchen table, noting the Spencer rifle leaning within easy reach. "That your iron doing the talking at the boneyard earlier?" Pike drew first. Makya said, his words economical as always. Bracken followed. I finished their conversation. Emmett nodded slow, chewing on this information like a man working through tough jerky. He'd known Pike and Bracken since they'd drifted into Willow Springs 6 months back, and neither had impressed him as pillars of moral rectitude. "They're claiming you bushwhacked them during lawful custody proceedings." "What lawful custody?" Mary interjected, setting down her sewing to face the young deputy square. "Show me court papers that say Abby belongs anywhere but with folks who give a damn about her welfare." "That's the peculiar part," Emmett admitted, shifting his weight like a man standing on uncertain ground. "Ain't no papers. Sheriff Doyle just told me to pass word girl was to be at Shaw's by morning. Said it was Creed's personal orders." The admission settled over the kitchen like dust from a building collapse. If there were no legal documents, then Pike and Bracken had been acting on Creed's whim rather than law, which made their actions closer to kidnapping than law enforcement. "There's something else troubling me," Emmett continued, lowering his voice like a man sharing secrets in church. "Ruth Hart came to see me twice this past month. Seemed spooked about something, kept talking about evidence that could bring down men with money and power. Said she had it all written down somewhere safe." This hit Mary and Makya like cold water in the face. Ruth Hart had always kept to herself, doing her washing and minding her own business, without stirring up trouble or calling attention to their circumstances. "She show you this evidence?" Mary asked. "No, and that's what ate at me." She'd come to my office, wring her hands, and talk about corruption and wrongdoing, but never produced hide nor hair of proof. Then she'd leave saying she needed more time to decide. And now she's in the ground. Makya observed his voice carrying the weight of understanding, buried so fast it made heads turn. Doc Morrison signed the paper, but he told me private-like that he barely got time to look her over. Said Hobb was pushing for immediate planning on account of fever spreading. Makya felt ice forming in his gut that had nothing to do with the Dakota winter pressing against the windows. Ruth's death, followed by Pike's immediate grab for Abby, was starting to look less like bad luck and more like careful planning. This evidence, she mentioned any notion where it might be now, could be in their old house, could be ash in somebody's stove, could be hidden where nobody's thought to look. Emmett's young face creased with worry. But if Ruth Hart really did have something damaging on powerful folks, and if somebody killed her to keep her quiet, then Abby's in more danger than a cat in a doghouse. Mary finished. They sat quiet for a spell, listening to the wind howl around the building and the distant rumble of machinery from Creed's mine, grinding ore into silver and silver into power that never slept. "I'll try to buy you some breathing room," Emmett said finally. But Sheriff Doyle takes his marching orders straight from Creed's counting house. Come morning, he'll expect compliance, and he ain't known for taking no gracious-like. After the deputy left, Mary made beds for her unexpected guests, while Makya sat by the dying fire, cleaning his rifle, despite the pain in his bandaged shoulder. Abby had fallen asleep in the chair by the stove, exhaustion finally winning over the fear and grief that had kept her moving through the day's trials. Poor little thing. Mary whispered, draping a blanket over the girl's thin shoulders. Lost her ma, and now facing a future she never chose. Ruth Hart was good people. Makya said quietly, his words measured like a man counting out gold. Worked honest, treated folks fair, never asked for more than her due. If she's dead for something she knew. He let the sentence hang unfinished, but its meaning was clear as creek water. Mary poured coffee from the pot that always seemed to be brewing, her movements thoughtful. What you did tonight, standing between that child and those wolves, took sand. Makya touched his wounded shoulder, remembering another time when doing right had cost him dear. Had a boy once. Lost him in the same fight that gave me this. He gestured toward the old injury. About Abby's age when the cavalry came calling. I'm sorry for your loss. Past's past. Makya replied, but his eyes held shadows that suggested some wounds never fully healed. Can't change what's buried. Maybe can protect what's still breathing. Outside, snow continued falling, covering Willow Springs in a blanket of false purity, while men with dark intentions made plans that would determine whether justice or corruption would rule the coming days. The blizzard had quit by the time Makya made his way back to the cemetery, moving through the knee-deep powder with the silent grace of a hunter who understood that survival sometimes demanded unthinkable acts. He'd slipped out through Mary's kitchen door, making sure both woman and child were sleeping sound, before venturing on a mission that violated both territorial law and the sacred ways of his people. The boneyard lay hushed under its white shroud headstones, standing like pale sentries, keeping watch over the dead. Makya found Ruth Hart's grave without trouble. The wooden cross stood stark against the unmarked snow, and beneath the white covering he could see signs that the earth had been disturbed more recently than 3 days past. Boot prints half filled with fresh snow, but still readable to eyes trained in tracking. 2 sets heavy and deliberate, accompanied by the drag marks of digging tools. Someone had been here after the shooting, and they'd brought shovels. Makya knelt beside the grave, studying the sign with the patience of a man who'd learned to read stories written in mud and bent grass. The prints told their tale. 2 men had approached sometime past midnight, begun excavating, then abandoned their work sudden-like, without finishing. Scratches on the wooden cross suggested they'd rigged ropes for leverage planning to haul something specific from the box below. The realization forming in Makya's mind was one that would have sickened most civilized folks. Disturbing the dead was serious business under territorial law, the kind that earned a man a rope necktie or iron bracelets for a considerable stretch. For a Lakota warrior, it meant violating sacred traditions about honoring those who'd crossed to the spirit world. But if Ruth Hart had been murdered, and if her killers were trying to bury evidence along with the body, then desperate times called for desperate measures. Makya began to dig. The work was hell in the sub-zero cold. His breath made ghost clouds that froze almost before they formed, and his wounded shoulders sent spikes of pure misery through his entire right side with every shovelful of frozen earth. Snow kept trying to fill his excavation faster than he could deepen it. But he pressed on, driven by growing certainty that Ruth Hart's death had been anything but natural. He was near 4 feet down when voices drifted through the cemetery, speaking urgent low, but carrying clear in the frigid air. They should have finished it the first go-round. Pike's familiar rasp cut through the darkness like a rusty blade. Now we got federal law sniffing around like hounds on a blood trail. Sure, how was I supposed to know that red devil would horn in? Replied another voice, Samuel Hobb, the undertaker, though he sounded nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rockers. You said it'd be simple extraction work. Might nothing simple when there's this much gold on the table. Pike snarled back. Creed's offering enough coin to buy half of Montana territory, but only if we can clean up this mess before that federal marshal gets his teeth in it. Federal marshal. This was news to Makya, but it explained the urgency in Pike's voice. Someone had called for outside law, which meant the window for covering tracks was closing fast as a coffin lid. The voices were maybe 50 yards off and getting closer. Makya dropped all pretense of quiet and dug like a man possessed, ignoring the fire in his shoulder as he cleared the last earth from the coffin lid. His hands were numb as wood, but he managed to work his knife blade under the wooden cover and pry it open with a crack that seemed to echo clear to the church bell. What he found in the pale starlight made his blood run cold despite the bone-deep chill. Ruth Hart's body bore witness to violence that no fever had ever caused. Dark finger marks circled her throat where powerful hands had squeezed the life from her, and at the base of her skull, a small, neat hole marked where a bullet had been fired close enough to powder burn the skin. The wound was too precise for accident, too deliberate for anything but murder done professional-like. There, by the Hart grave. Pike's shout shattered the cemetery's peace like glass hitting stone. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, somebody's digging her up. Hobbs' voice cracked with panic. The first gunshot whined overhead as Makya quick grabbed the flattened slug from the coffin wood where it had lodged after passing through Ruth's skull. He wrapped the evidence in a piece of shirt cloth and tucked it safe inside his vest, then rolled behind a large headstone as more shots began chipping stone and bark around his position. Pike and Hobb had spread out trying to box him in while staying clear of that Spencer's considerable reach. Their muzzle flashes lit up the snow-covered graveyard like deadly lightning, and leads sang through the air with the voice of violent men seeking violent solutions. Makya's rifle answered back. Back the heavy boom rolling across the cemetery like thunder from a clear sky. His shot took Hobb in the meat of his shoulder, spinning the undertaker around and dropping him into a snowdrift with a scream that probably woke half the town. He's got the evidence. Pike shouted, desperation plain in his voice. Can't let the bastard reach town. But Makya was already moving, using the graveyard's terrain, like a man who'd learned to fight on ground that offered little cover and less mercy. His shoulder felt like molten lead had been poured into the joint, and fresh blood was soaking through his bandages, but he forced himself to keep moving. The bullet in his vest pocket seemed heavy as an anvil, weighted with the truth of murder and conspiracy. By the time Pike and the wounded Hobb reached his last position, the Lakota warrior had melted back into the pre-dawn darkness, leaving only blood drops in the snow and Ruth Hart's violated grave as testament to the night's grim work. Dawn was painting the eastern sky pale gold when Makya slipped back into Mary Chilton's kitchen, moving careful-like to avoid waking his hosts despite the urgency of what he'd discovered. Mary was already up making coffee and breakfast with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to early rising and hard work. She took one look at his blood-stained clothes and hollow expression and began heating water for fresh bandages without wasting time on unnecessary questions. "Find what you were huntin'?" she asked quietly, helping him out of his coat. Makya placed the cloth-wrapped bullet on her kitchen table with the reverence due a sacred object. Ruth Hart was murdered. Strangled first, then shot close range to make sure. This here's the slug that killed her. Mary stared at the evidence like it might bite her. Sweet Lord above. Who'd want to murder a washerwoman? Somebody who couldn't afford to let her keep whatever she'd written down. Makya replied, wincing as Mary began cleaning his reopened wound. Pike and Hobb were at the grave tonight, trying to eliminate what I found. They know exactly what happened to Ruth Hart, and they're scared enough to kill anybody who threatens to spill it. We need to take this straight to Sheriff Doyle. Doyle takes his orders from Creed's wallet. Makya said, his voice flat as hammered iron. Pike works for Creed. Hobb buried Ruth quick without proper looking, probably on Creed's say-so. Taking this evidence to Doyle would be like delivering ourselves to Ruth's killers with ribbons tied on. Mary poured coffee with hands that trembled slightly, the full weight of their discovery settling on her like a lead blanket. Murder, conspiracy, corruption, reaching to the highest levels of local authority in a town owned by one man. Justice could be scarcer than water in August. What about young Emmett? He seemed straight enough. Straight and honest. Makya agreed. But still wearing Doyle's badge and taking his pay. One honest deputy against a whole rotten system might not be enough horse to pull this load. Footsteps on the stairs interrupted them as Abby came down for breakfast, rubbing sleep from her eyes and looking small and fragile in one of Mary's spare nightgowns. Her dark hair was tousled from restless sleep, and shadows under her eyes spoke of grief too heavy for such young shoulders. "I heard talking," she said quiet-like. "Are the bad men coming back?" Mary knelt beside her, smoothing the child's hair with gentle fingers. "Not if we have anything to say about it, sweetheart. But we need to make some hard choices about keeping you safe." Makya studied the girl's face, seeing intelligence and steel there, despite her obvious fear. She'd already shouldered more loss than many adults faced in a lifetime, and now she was staring down the barrel of losing her freedom as well. "Abby," he said, choosing his words, careful-like. "Did your ma ever mention having important papers, something valuable she kept hidden?" The girl considered this with the seriousness of someone who'd learned that grown-up conversations often decided her fate. "She had a secret place under a loose board in our kitchen. Sometimes she'd take out papers and money, more money than washing ever brought in. But she told me never to look, never to tell anyone." Mary and Makya traded meaningful glances. If Ruth's ledger was still in the house, she'd shared with Abby it might contain the evidence needed to bring down the whole rotten conspiracy. "House probably belongs to Creed now," Mary observed. "Can't just waltz in and help ourselves to evidence." "Then we need outside help," Makya replied. "Somebody with authority that don't answer to Creed or his gold." As if conjured by their words, a sharp knock came at the front door, not the polite tap of a social caller, but the official announcement of law enforcement conducting business. Mary opened it to find Emmett Rusk on her porch, his young face grave with unwelcome news. "Morning, Mrs. Chilton. Need to palaver with Makya and the girl about last night's doings." Before Mary could answer, Emmett's expression changed to alarm as he looked past her toward the street. "We got bigger trouble headed this way," he said tersely. "Sheriff Doyle's coming with enough men to start a small war, and they're loaded for bear." The sound of many horses confirmed his warning. Through the front window, they could see Sheriff Jonas Doyle leading at least a dozen armed men toward the boarding house, their faces set with the grim determination of hunters closing in on cornered prey. "They've got warrants," Emmett continued quickly. Charges against Makya for disturbing the peace and unlawful violence. Orders to take Abby into protective custody pending placement with Shaw. No back door. Makya said immediate-like, grabbing his rifle despite the fire in his wounded shoulder. We ain't ready for this dance. But even as they moved toward the rear of the house, more riders appeared in the alley behind Mary's property. They were surrounded, trapped neat as rabbits in a snare that was closing with the slow inevitability of winter coming to the high country. Sheriff Jonas Doyle was a man who understood the delicate balance between law and profit that kept frontier towns running smooth. Thick-set and graying with small calculating eyes that missed precious little, he'd built his reputation on knowing which orders to follow without question and which investigations to conclude quick and quiet. Standing on Mary Chilton's front porch with a warrant in one hand and his service iron in the other, he represented the careful arrangement between justice and commerce that kept Willow Springs profitable for those who mattered. "Open up, Mrs. Chilton," he called through the oak panels. "This here's official territorial business." Inside, Makya was already moving Abby toward the narrow staircase, guiding her with quiet urgency toward a small storage room behind the chimney where she could hide among forgotten belongings. "Whatever happens," he told her in words barely louder than breathing, "you stay put till Mary or me comes personal-like. Don't trust nobody else, no matter what badge they wear or what yarn they spin." Abby nodded with the grave understanding of a child who'd learned that staying invisible often meant staying alive. Her dark eyes reflected knowledge far beyond her 10 years as she squeezed into the cramped space behind a trunk filled with Mary's winter clothes. Mary smoothed her dress and arranged her face into mild curiosity before opening the door. "Sheriff Doyle, rather early for calling, wouldn't you say?" "Ain't making social calls," Doyle replied curtly, pushing past her into the parlor where his deputies spread out with practiced efficiency. "Got legal warrants here duly signed and witnessed." His gaze swept the room, noting signs of recent occupation, coffee cups, a man's coat, and the Spencer rifle that Makya hadn't had time to hide complete. "Where's the Indian?" "Which Indian might that be, Sheriff?" "Don't play word games with me, woman. Makya's been causing considerable grief, and I aim to cork that bottle before it gets worse." Makya appeared at the top of the stairs, moving slow and keeping his hands visible to avoid giving the deputies excuse for gunplay. He descended with quiet dignity, his wounded shoulder held careful, but his bearing straight and proud. "Right here, Sheriff." "Good. You're under arrest for disturbing the peace, destruction of property, and carrying firearms without proper territorial registration." Doyle's smile held all the warmth of a January blizzard. "Seems there's questions about your legal standing to bear arms in this jurisdiction. Papers are filed with the Indian Agency." Makya replied, his words economical as always. "Agent Collins can verify when he gets back from Bismarck." "That's fine, but you can cool your heels in jail while we sort the paperwork. Might take considerable time." Doyle turned his attention to Mary. "You're charged with harboring a known fugitive and interfering with lawful custody proceedings. And I'm taking the Hart girl into protective custody for her own good." "A protection from what?" Mary asked. "From living wild and ungoverned like some animal. Shaw's home provides proper Christian education, useful skills, and steady work for orphaned children. Better than the corrupting influences she might encounter elsewhere." Emmett Rusk stood in the parlor doorway, his young face troubled, but his hand resting on his gun butt in a gesture that might have meant support or threat depending on circumstances. "Sheriff," he said carefully, "maybe we ought to discuss the specific charges before. Maybe you ought to remember who signs your vouchers." Deputy Doyle cut him off with brutal efficiency. "Unless you want to explain to Judge Morrison why you're questioning lawful warrants signed by his own hand." The rebuke hit Emmett like a physical blow, and Makya noticed how the young man's hand moved toward his vest pocket before catching himself. Small gesture, but it suggested Emmett might be carrying something he didn't want discovered. "Where's the girl?" Doyle demanded. "I'm sure I wouldn't know which girl you mean." Mary replied with bland innocence. Deputy Crane, a brutal-looking man, with scarred knuckles and the kind of grin that promised pain, started for the staircase. I'll root her out, Sheriff. Kids ain't worth spit at hiding when you know the tricks. Careful like Crane. Doyle warned. Don't want to spook the poor orphan child more than necessary. Rather than let them tear Mary's house apart while Abby cowered in terror upstairs, Makya made the tactical choice to surrender himself and trust that someone could get word to higher authority before it was too late. I'll come peaceful, he said, stepping forward with hands raised. Mrs. Chilton ain't done nothing wrong. Leave her be. Afraid that ain't possible, Doyle replied with false regret. She broke territorial law, harboring a fugitive and interfering with official custody proceedings. As iron manacles closed around Makya's wrists, he caught Emmett's eye and nodded almost imperceptible toward the kitchen, where the bullet evidence still lay wrapped on the table. The young deputy seemed to understand, drifting casual-like in that direction, while the other lawmen focused on their prisoners. Sheriff Emmett called out, Judge Morrison sent word about the Henderson mining claim dispute. Says he needs to see you 4 court convenes. Doyle frowned, his attention pulled away from his captives. Judge Morrison's business interests often butted heads with Creed's operations, and maintaining peace between both men required delicate handling. That'll keep. I got prisoners to process and a child to locate. He specifically mentioned something urgent about claim jumpers from the consolidated outfit. Said there might be federal complications if it ain't handled proper. This gave Doyle genuine pause. The Consolidated Mining Company had been trying to muscle into territorial operations for months, and any legal challenge needed immediate attention before it could escalate to federal involvement. Fine, he said after a moment's consideration. Process the prisoners, then turn this place inside out till you find the Hart girl. She's here somewhere, and I want her at Shaw's before the sun hits noon. As they were led toward the jail, Makya glimpsed Emmett palming the wrapped bullet from the kitchen table with the smooth motion of someone who'd practiced sleight of hand. The evidence disappeared into the deputy's vest pocket just as Crane returned from his fruitless search upstairs. But something in Emmett's manner troubled Makya, a nervousness that went beyond normal tension of defying his superior. The young man avoided direct eye contact, and his movements had the careful precision of someone trying not to reveal more than intended. In situations where trust could mean the difference between breathing and bleeding out, small details like these mattered more than most folks wanted to admit. The Willow Springs jail occupied a squat stone building that had been built to withstand both Dakota winters and desperate men with nothing left to lose. 3 cells lined the back wall, each equipped with iron bars thick as a man's thumb, and a single narrow window that provided just enough light to remind prisoners what they were missing. Makya and Mary were placed in separate cells close enough to speak in whispers, but far enough apart that Deputy Crane, left on guard duty, couldn't overhear everything they discussed. Crane himself seemed content to work through a bottle of 40-rod whiskey while warming his backside by the pot-bellied stove. Think young Emmett got the evidence, Mary whispered. Saw him pocket it slick as you please, Makya replied. Question is what he aims to do with it now. You don't trust him. Don't trust nobody complete right now. Too much gold involved too many folks with reasons to keep secrets buried deep. They fell silent as Crane stirred from his stupor, looking around the jail with the bleary attention of someone trying to remember where he was and why. When he noticed his prisoners were awake, he favored them with a gap-toothed grin. Hope y'all are finding the accommodation suitable, he said with mock politeness. Sheriff Doyle wants to make sure you're properly looked after while we sort your legal difficulties. Right considerate. Mary replied, her voice dry as alkali dust. Oh, we're mighty considerate here in Willow Springs. Take that Hart woman, for instance. When she took sick with fever, Doc Morrison tended her personal-like. And when the fever took her quick undertaker, Hobb made sure she got proper Christian burial without delay. Crane's words carried implications that made both prisoners' blood run cold as mountain snow. He was talking about Ruth Hart's death, like it had been a carefully managed process rather than a medical emergency. Fever can be unpredictable. Makya observed his voice neutral as creek water. Oh, this fever was mighty predictable. Crane replied, his grin widening to show more missing teeth. Struck down a woman who'd been making unreasonable demands, threatening to spread lies about respected citizens. Amazing how nature corrects these problems when left to its own devices. The guard's casual discussion of murder revealed the depth of rot that infected Willow Springs from top to bottom. These men weren't just covering up crime, they were proud of their efficiency in eliminating problems. Around midday, they received a visitor that made the jail's temperature seem to drop another 10 degrees. The door opened to admit a woman in severe black dress, flanked by two large men who looked more like prison guards than charitable workers. Matron Shaw was perhaps 50 winters old, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a punitive bun and eyes like chips of winter ice. She carried herself with a rigid posture of someone accustomed to absolute authority over those weaker than herself. "I've come to collect the Hart child," she announced in a voice that brooked no argument. "She ain't here," Crane replied, trying to straighten his uniform and hide the whiskey bottle. "Still turning over rocks looking for her." "Then turn them more efficiently. Mr. Creed has made specific arrangements for the child's care and education. I don't intend to return empty-handed." Shaw's gaze fixed on Mary through the cell bars with the intensity of a hawk studying field mice. Perhaps Mrs. Chilton could assist in locating the girl. After all, she's been harboring the child unlawfully. "I'm sure I don't take your meaning," Mary replied with steady composure. "The Shaw home provides excellent care for orphaned children." Shaw continued as if Mary hadn't spoken. "Proper food, warm shelter, Christian education, and useful work to prepare them for productive adult lives. Far superior to the corrupting influences they might encounter in less supervised environments." "Corrupting influences like kindness and genuine affection?" Mary asked. Shaw's expression hardened like concrete setting in winter. "Kindness that teaches children to disrespect lawful authority is no kindness at all. Affection that encourages association with savages and criminals does them no favors whatsoever. Only savages I see are the ones who murdered Ruth Hart," Makya said quiet-like. The words dropped into the jail's atmosphere like stones into still water. Shaw's face went pale, then flushed with what might have been anger or fear. "Oh, how dare you spread such vicious calumny," she snapped. "Ruth Hart died of fever properly certified by Dr. Morrison and witnessed by Undertaker Hobb. To suggest otherwise is the vilest sort of slander." "Easy to suggest when you've seen proof with your own eyes," Makya replied. Shaw stepped closer to the cell bars, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow seemed more threatening than any shout. "Listen carefully, you heathen animal. There is no proof because there was no crime. Ruth Hart was a troubled woman who made poor choices and paid natural consequences. Her daughter will be properly raised to avoid similar mistakes. And anyone who interferes with that proper raising will discover that accidents befall troublemakers just as easily as they befell washerwomen." With that threat delivered neat as a wrapped package, Shaw swept out of the jail, leaving behind the scent of harsh soap and the promise of violence disguised as Christian charity. Evening brought news that changed everything like lightning splitting a clear sky. Emmett returned to the jail carrying a telegraph message, his face showing barely contained excitement mixed with obvious apprehension. "Federal Marshal Harlan Coles on tonight's train," he announced, showing the wire to Crane. "Should arrive just 4 midnight. Crane sobered fast at this news, whiskey haze clearing from his eyes as he contemplated federal involvement in what had been purely local business. "What's a federal marshal want in our little burg?" "Wire don't say," Emmett replied. "But I reckon we'll find out soon enough." As darkness settled over the town and temperature dropped toward the bone-cracking cold that characterized Dakota Territory winters, Makya stared through his cell window and wondered if any of them would live long enough to see federal justice. Somewhere in the frozen streets outside, a 10-year-old girl was hiding from men who'd kill her to protect their secrets. And somewhere else, those same men were making desperate plans to eliminate witnesses before morning could bring the light of outside scrutiny to their carefully constructed web of corruption and murder. Marshal Harlan Cole stepped off the westbound train into swirling snow and engine steam, his long coat whipping in the harsh wind that swept across the depot platform, like the breath of winter itself. He was a man in his mid-40s, with gray-streaked hair, and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent in hard places doing work that required both steel nerve and flexible conscience. The federal badge pinned to his vest caught light from the depot's oil lamps, marking him as someone whose authority reached beyond local politics and personal loyalties. Emmett Rusk waited on the platform, shifting from foot to foot, like a man standing on hot coals as passengers disembarked around them. When Cole approached, the young deputy seemed torn between relief and worry, as if federal intervention might solve their problems or create entirely new ones. "Marshal Cole, I'm Deputy Emmett Rusk. Sent the wire about suspected corruption and possible murder." "Pleasure, Deputy." Cole's handshake was firm without being intimidating, conveying competence earned through experience. "Your telegram mentioned serious criminal activity. I'd like specifics." "Yes, sir, but maybe we should jaw somewhere private. These matters involve prominent local citizens." They made their way to the depot's small office, where the station master discreetly withdrew to give them privacy. Once alone, Emmett pulled the wrapped bullet from his vest pocket and placed it on the desk between them, like a man laying down his last card. "This came from Ruth Hart's body," he said quiet-like. "She was murdered 3 days back, but local authorities covered it by claiming fever. Bullet bears distinctive markings that could identify the weapon." Cole examined the evidence with careful attention, noting the crescent-shaped scar that marked it as having been fired from a damaged gun barrel. "Where'd you come by this?" A man named Makya dug it from the victim's grave. "I know that sounds irregular, but..." "Makya's the Lakota warrior mentioned in your wire." "Yes, sir. He's been protecting the victim's daughter, 10-year-old named Abby Hart. There have been attempts to force her into an orphanage that profits from child labor." Cole pocketed the bullet and leaned back, processing information with the methodical approach of someone accustomed to sorting truth from deception in complicated circumstances. "Tell me about the weapon that fired this shot." "Sheriff Doyle carries a Colt Navy with a split barrel from an old misfire. Always brags about how it still shoots true despite the flaw. That bullet would bear the same crescent marking his gun produces." The implications hit Cole like a physical blow. If the local sheriff had committed murder to cover corruption, then every aspect of law enforcement in Willow Springs was compromised beyond repair. "Where are Makya and the child now?" "Makya's in jail on trumped charges. Girls in hiding couldn't let them get hands on her before you arrived." Emmett's voice carried desperation beneath its attempted professional composure. "Marshal, these people killed a woman to silence her. They won't hesitate to murder a child if it serves their purposes." Cole stood and checked his pocket watch, noting it was near 1 o'clock. Some kinds of business couldn't wait for daylight or proper procedure. "Deputy, I need you to choose sides here. You can keep serving under a corrupt sheriff and hope this blows over quiet, or you can help me clean up this mess. But once you choose, there ain't no going back." Emmett's response came without hesitation. "Became a lawman to protect innocent folks, sir, not help killers cover their tracks. Tell me what you need." They made their way through snow-covered streets toward the jail, moving careful to avoid attracting attention from anyone watching for signs of federal activity. Cole had brought 2 experienced agents with him, men who understood frontier corruption and knew how to handle situations where local authority couldn't be trusted. The jail was dark except for a single lamp burning in the front office, where Crane was supposed to be maintaining watch. They found him unconscious in his chair, empty whiskey bottle clutched in his lap, and cell keys lying on the floor beside him. "Professional," Cole muttered, then gestured for Emmett to wake the prisoners while he secured the building. Makya and Mary emerged from their cells, looking tired but alert, both showing the wariness that came from never knowing who could be trusted when corruption ran deep as artesian wells. "You Marshal Cole?" Makya asked, noting the federal badge in competent manner. "That's right. Deputy Rusk tells me you have information about Ruth Hart's murder." "Saw the body myself," Makya replied without wasted words. "Strangled and shot close range. Someone tried passing it off as fever, but evidence was clear enough. The bullet matches Sheriff Doyle's damaged revolver," Emmett added. "He's the one who killed her." Cole absorbed this confirmation with the calm professionalism of someone who dealt with corrupt lawmen before. "Where's the Hart child?" "Safe," Mary said. "But not for long if Creed's people find her." Before anyone could respond, and the sound of approaching horses echoed through the night, multiple riders moving with purpose rather than casual travel. Through the jail's windows, they could see torches and lanterns converging on their location, like wolves closing on wounded prey. "Looks like someone noticed federal interest," Cole observed. "How many men does Doyle usually travel with?" "Depends on how desperate he's getting," Emmett replied. "Could be half the county if Creed's paying enough." The first gunshot shattered the window, sending glass flying, and announcing that talking time was over. More shots followed, and wooden walls began splintering under sustained fire from what sounded like a small army with plenty of ammunition. "Back way," Cole asked. "Through the cells," Makya said, leading them deeper as flames began licking at oil-soaked wood around the broken window. They fought their way out through a rear door into the alley, where Cole's federal agents waited with horses and expressions suggesting they'd been expecting trouble. The jail was already fully engulfed with flames, shooting through the roof like hellfire seeking heaven. "Which way?" Agent Thompson asked. "The church," Emmett suggested. "Father Leland will give sanctuary." They mounted and rode hard through snow-filled streets, horses' hooves throwing up clouds of white powder as pursuit formed behind them. Gunshots cracked in the darkness, and bullets whined past with the sound of angry hornets seeking blood. St. Matthew's Church loomed ahead, bell tower dark against star-filled sky. But even as they approached, armed men emerged from shadows around the building, cutting off what had seemed like their safest refuge. "Trap," Mary said, pulling her horse up short. "Whole town's bought or bullied," Cole realized. That was when a small voice called from the church's bell tower, high above the armed men surrounding the building. "Up here, there's a way up the back." Abby Hart's young voice carried clear in the cold air. She'd been hiding in the one place nobody thought to search thorough, the bell tower itself, reachable only through a maintenance ladder most adults would find difficult to climb. "I was back of the church," Emmett said. "Ladder built into the stone wall." They circled the building, staying in shadows, cast by other structures, making their way to the narrow iron ladder built into the church's rear wall. One by one, they climbed through bitter cold toward the small window that opened into the tower above. Abby helped pull them through her small hands, surprisingly strong, despite everything she'd endured. "You hurt?" Mary asked, gathering the child close. "I'm fine," Abby replied with resilience that would have made her mother proud. "But there's something you need to know. I found Mama's hidden papers." She produced a leather portfolio from behind the church bell where she'd been hiding with patience that spoke of hard-learned survival skills. "Got them from our old house before the bad men could find them," she explained. "Mama always said if something happened to her, I should bring these to someone who could read them proper." Cole opened the portfolio by candlelight, his expression growing more serious as he examined documents inside. What he found was more devastating than any of them had imagined, a complete record of systematic corruption that reached far beyond simple murder into the heart of territorial government itself. The documents that Abby Hart had salvaged from her mother's hiding place told a story of corruption that made simple murder look like child's play. Ruth Hart hadn't been just a laundress who'd stumbled onto dangerous information. She'd been methodically documenting a conspiracy involving land fraud, mining rights manipulation, and the systematic exploitation of children for profit. But the centerpiece of her evidence was a legal document that explained why she'd died and why Creed was desperate to control her daughter. Her water rights. Cole said quiet-like, holding up an official territorial deed by candlelight. Ruth Hart owned exclusive rights to the Knife River, including all water used by Creed's mining operations. The implications hit everyone in the bell tower like a physical blow. In the arid Dakota Territory, water rights were more valuable than silver itself. Whoever controlled the river could determine which businesses lived and which died. And Ruth Hart had possessed legal authority to shut down Creed's entire empire simply by cutting off his water access. "How'd she come by water rights?" Mary asked. "Looks like inheritance," Cole replied, examining the deed more careful. "From her father, Thomas Morrison, probably Judge Morrison's kin. Rights passed down through the family, but nobody realized their value till Creed's operation made water access crucial." Abby looked up from where she'd been sitting quiet beside the church bell. "Mama said the water belonged to everyone, not just rich men who wanted to poison it with their digging. She was planning to make Mr. Creed clean up the river or lose his permission to use it. Nark and Creed couldn't allow that," Makya observed. "His whole operation depended on unlimited water and the ability to dump waste wherever convenient. So he had her killed," Cole concluded. But that only solved half his problem. Water rights passed to her heir, which means they belong to Abby now. The 10-year-old girl stared at the adults with eyes that seemed far too old for someone her age. "You saying I own the river? According to this deed, you control water access for the entire Knife River Valley," Cole confirmed. "Makes you one of the most powerful landowners in the territory." Before anyone could process this revelation, complete gunfire erupted from the street below. Doyle and his men had discovered their escape route and were now attempting to storm the church itself. Apparently no longer caring about sanctity or potential witnesses. "Trapped up here like cats in a tree," Emmett observed, peering down through the tower's narrow window. "Not necessarily," Abby said quiet-like. "There's something else you should know about the church. Father Leland showed me when I was hiding there's a way down into the mine tunnels from the basement. Old miners used it during services so they wouldn't track mud through the main church." Cole looked at the child with growing respect. Even in terror and confusion, she was thinking strategic about escape routes and tactical advantages. "These tunnels connect to Creed's mine." "All the mines," Abby replied. "Whole network under the town. Mama used to say the ground was more whole than dirt from all the digging." It was a desperate plan. Entering the mine tunnels meant descending into Creed's stronghold, where he could control terrain and eliminate them at leisure. But staying in the bell tower meant certain capture or death from the growing fire below. "They'll lead the way," Cole decided. They made their way down through the church, avoiding the main sanctuary where smoke was seeping through floorboards from fires set by Doyle's men. The basement entrance to mine tunnels was hidden behind a false wall that looked like ordinary stone foundation, but swung open on concealed hinges. The tunnel beyond was narrow and low, barely wide enough for a grown man to walk upright. It smelled of earth and dampness, and something else, the metallic scent of violence that seemed to permeate everything connected to Creed's operations. "Stay close," Cole warned as they entered the underground maze. "These tunnels are likely where we'll make our final stand." None of them realized that Barlo Creed was already waiting in the depths below, along with revelations that would shake everything they thought they knew about Abby Hart's parentage and the real reason her mother had died. The mine tunnels beneath Willow Springs formed a labyrinth carved by decades of silver-hungry men, creating a network of passages, shafts, and chambers that extended far beyond any official survey. Some tunnels were wide enough for ore carts and supported by heavy timber, while others were narrow crawl spaces following promising veins. All were dangerous, poorly ventilated, structurally unsound, and filled with hidden shafts that could swallow a man without trace. Cole led their small group through darkness, guided by Abby's whispered directions and dim light from a single lantern taken from the church. Behind them, sounds of pursuit echoed as Doyle's men discovered the tunnel entrance and began following their trail into the underground maze. This way, Abby said quiet-like, pointing toward a passage that looked no different from dozen others they'd passed. Mama brought me down here once when she was cleaning for miners. Said I should know my way around in case of emergency. Ruth Hart's foresight was saving their lives now, though the bitter irony wasn't lost that they were using knowledge gained from the murdered woman to navigate toward what might be their own deaths. The tunnel Abby chose led deeper into the mine complex, descending through chambers where silver ore had been extracted and processed. Air grew thicker with each step, heavy with dust and lingering smell of explosives. Somewhere ahead, water dripped with monotonous persistence, and wooden support beams creaked ominously under weight of earth above. "How much farther?" Mary whispered, her voice tight with strain of moving through the claustrophobic space. "Not far," Abby replied. "Big chamber up ahead where they keep machinery." But when they reached the chamber, she described it wasn't empty. 3 lanterns cast dancing shadows on rough-hewn walls, and 2 men stood waiting with rifles pointed in their direction. One was Pike, his face twisted with rage and dried blood from where his earlier wound had reopened. The other was well-dressed in expensive clothes that looked incongruous in the dusty mine environment. Barlo Creed stepped into the lantern light like an actor taking center stage, his silver hair immaculate and bearing commanding despite their underground setting. He studied their group with calculating gaze of a man evaluating potential purchases. "Marshal Cole, I presume," he said with mock politeness. "Welcome to my domain. Trust you've found the journey illuminating." "We're Barlo Creed," Cole replied, keeping his rifle ready despite being outnumbered. "You're under arrest for conspiracy murder and fraud." Creed's laugh echoed off stone walls with harsh amusement. "I'm afraid jurisdiction becomes rather flexible down here, Marshal. These tunnels belong to me, along with everything else of value in this territory." His gaze shifted to Abby, who stood between Mary and Makya with quiet courage that would have made her mother proud. "Hello, Abigail. Far too long since we've had proper conversation." "You killed my mama," Abby said with simple directness. "Your mother made some exceedingly poor decisions." Creed replied, his voice taking on patronizing tone that made everyone want to reach for weapons. "She forgot her proper place and began making unreasonable demands. Sometimes correction becomes necessary. She was going to cut off your water," Cole observed. "Exercise her legal rights as owner of Knife River water rights." "Legal rights?" Creed's expression darkened like storm clouds over prairie. "Your mother had no legal right to anything, child. Everything she possessed came from my generosity, my protection, my willingness to overlook her various indiscretions." He reached into his coat and produced a leather folder containing several official-looking documents. "Birth certificate," he said, placing first paper on nearby crate. "Abigail Ruth Creed, born October 15th, 1871. Father listed as Barlo Edmund Creed." The words hit the chamber's atmosphere like physical blows. Mary gasped and stepped protectively closer to Abby, while Makya's grip tightened on his rifle despite their hopeless tactical situation. "That's impossible," Mary said. "Ruth would never, wouldn't she?" Creed interrupted coldly. "Young woman alone, pregnant, facing poverty and social ostracism, I offered security, respectability, future for her child. All she had to do was accept my support and acknowledge truth about Abigail's parentage. He produced another document legal agreement in Ruth Hart's careful handwriting. Contract of acknowledgement. Ruth Hart agrees to accept financial support in exchange for recognizing Barlo Creed as father of her child and granting appropriate parental rights. Abby stared at documents like they were venomous snakes preparing to strike. "You ain't my father," she said. But her voice carried less certainty than before. "I'm afraid the law disagrees, child. These documents are properly witnessed and recorded with territorial government. Whatever Ruth told you about your parentage was simply comfortable fiction designed to spare your feelings." Cole examined papers by lantern light, noting official seals and signatures that appeared genuine. If legitimate, they would completely change the legal situation. Creed would have parental rights, superseding any claims by Mary or other potential guardians. But something troubled him. Men didn't usually murder mothers of their own children, even when those women became inconvenient. "If she's really your daughter," he said careful-like, "why have Ruth killed? Why not exercise parental rights through courts?" Creed's composure cracked slightly, revealing something darker underneath. "Because Ruth threatened to expose certain business arrangements that would have been inconvenient to explain to territorial authorities. She'd become unstable, paranoid, making wild accusations about corruption and fraud." "You mean she was going to tell truth about your bribery and land manipulation?" "She was going to destroy everything I've built over imagined grievances and feminine hysteria." Creed's voice rose with genuine anger. "She forgot that her comfortable life, her child's security, everything they possessed existed only through my continued goodwill. So you had her murdered to keep her quiet." Sheriff Doyle acted on his own initiative to protect legitimate business interests. "I never directly ordered Ruth Hart's death. It was distinction without much difference. Creed might not have given explicit orders, but he'd created circumstances that made murder seem necessary to subordinates." "It don't matter now," Pike interrupted, raising his rifle with obvious impatience. "Got all the witnesses trapped down here like rats. Time to finish this and seal tunnels behind us." But before anyone could act on Pike's suggestion, Abby Hart did something that surprised everyone in the chamber. Instead of cowering, she stepped forward and faced the man claiming to be her father, with moral courage that had gotten her mother killed. "You're lying," she said, clear as mountain water. "About being my father, about the papers, about everything. Mama told me truth, and she wasn't no liar. A child, you're too young to understand adult complexities. I understand you're a bad man who hurts people to get what he wants." Abby interrupted. "And I understand real fathers don't get their children's mothers murdered." From tunnels behind them came sounds of approaching voices. Doyle's men had tracked them through the maze and were closing in. Time was running out for any resolution that didn't involve considerable bloodshed. But Abby wasn't finished. She reached into her coat pocket and produced something that made Barlo Creed's face go white as fresh snow. It was a small tintype photograph in silver frame showing a young man in Union Army uniform, with dark hair and eyes remarkably like Abby's own. "This is my real father," she said with quiet pride. "Thomas Morrison, who died fighting rebels at Antietam before I was born. Mama kept his picture hidden, but she showed it to me every birthday and told stories about what a good, brave man he was." The photograph passed from hand to hand in lantern light, and everyone could see obvious family resemblance between dead soldier and living child. More damaging to Creed's claims was inscription on the frame: "To my beloved Ruth and our unborn child, all my love. Thomas Morrison, 1862. "You forged the birth certificate," Cole realized. "Ruth Hart was never your mistress, and Abby's not your daughter. You wanted control over water rights, so you created false documents to establish legal claim." Creed's careful facade finally crumbled, complete revealing desperate, obsessive man underneath. "She worked for me," he screamed. Took my money, lived under my protection, that gave me rights. They gave you nothing. Makya said quiet-like. Ruth Hart earned every penny you paid, and she owed you nothing beyond honest work for honest wages. Sound of boots in tunnels was getting closer, and Pike was shifting his rifle between targets, clearly preparing to start shooting regardless of Creed's plans for subtler resolution. That was when final surprise emerged from tunnel entrance. But instead of Doyle's corrupt deputies, Federal Agent Thompson appeared with 3 other lawmen badges glinting in lantern light. U.S. Marshals, Thompson announced. Drop weapons and surrender. Pike opened fire immediate, his bullet catching Thompson in shoulder and spinning him around. The chamber erupted into chaos as everyone dove for cover among mining equipment and support timbers. In confusion of gunfire and shouting, Abby Hart disappeared into tunnel maze that she knew better than anyone else in the underground chamber. She was no longer just victim waiting rescue. She was participant in her own salvation, using knowledge her mother had given her to turn tables on men who'd destroyed her family. The gunfight in the mine chamber erupted with brutal intensity, muzzle flashes lighting underground space like lightning in a bottle. Pike and Creed had taken cover behind massive ore-crushing machine, while federal lawmen spread among support timbers and mining equipment filling the chamber. Confined space made every shot echo like thunder, and gun smoke quickly choked the air with gray clouds thick as fog. Makya found himself separated from Mary and Cole, pinned behind pile of ore sacks, while bullets chewed chunks from stone walls around him. His wounded shoulder was screaming fire, and fresh blood soaked through bandages, but he forced himself to return, aimed fire with his Spencer. In the chaos, he'd lost track of Abby. The girl had vanished into tunnel maze with silent efficiency of someone who knew every passage and hiding place. "Where's the child?" Cole shouted over gunfire. "Safe." Mary called back from her position behind overturned mining cart. She knows these tunnels better than anybody. Pike was advancing through the chamber using mining equipment for cover as he tried to flank their position. He moved with deadly competence of someone who'd done considerable killing and expected to do more before night was finished. "Smoke 'em out," he screamed to unseen Confederates in tunnels beyond. "Seal the passages and let 'em choke." The threat was real. Mine tunnels were notorious for cave-ins and fires that could trap anyone unfortunate enough to be underground when disaster struck. But even as Pike shouted orders, new sounds echoed from tunnel maze, distant gunfire, shouts of confusion, and what sounded like men calling for help. Sheriff Doyle's voice carried through stone passages, high with panic. "She's collapsed, the main support, we're cut off." Abby Hart hadn't just hidden in the maze, she'd used knowledge of structural weaknesses to trap Doyle's men in tunnels, depending on single main support beam. By removing wooden prop holding tons of earth and stone, she'd created cave-in that blocked escape route for half of Creed's forces. "Smart little wildcat," Makya muttered, and then raised rifle as Pike came around edge of ore crusher with murder in his eyes. The Spencer boomed, and Pike dove sideways as heavy bullets shattered stone where his head had been. But the mine foreman was far from finished. He rolled behind another piece of equipment and began working toward Mary's position with predatory determination. Creed himself seemed to have lost all coherent strategy, firing wild in all directions, while screaming about his rights and property and injustices being visited upon him by ungrateful inferiors. His expensive clothes were torn, and filthy, carefully maintained appearance dissolved into something approaching madness. "She belongs to me," he shrieked like man possessed. "Everything here belongs to me." But his claim was challenged by small voice that carried clear through the chamber despite ongoing gunfire. "No, it don't." Abby Hart stood at entrance to one of side tunnels, holding burning torch in one hand and something else in the other, something that made Barlo Creed stop shooting and stare with growing horror. It was stick of dynamite with shortened fuse already lit and burning down toward explosive charge. In hands of desperate 10-year-old girl who'd lost everything she'd ever loved, it represented power to bring down entire chamber and everyone in it. "Abby, no," Mary screamed. "She's bluffing." Pike snarled, raising rifle. "Kid ain't got sand for it." But Abby's voice was steady as winter ice when she spoke again. Mama taught me about dynamite when we were cleaning mining camps. Said it was dangerous, but sometimes dangerous things were only way to stop bad men from hurting people. She held up burning fuse where everyone could see how little remained before detonation. You got maybe 30 seconds to drop them guns and let Marshal Cole arrest you proper. Otherwise, we all go meet Mama together. The threat was credible because it came from child who had nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. She'd watched her mother die for trying to protect her, seen corrupt men destroy everything she'd ever loved, faced possibility of being claimed as daughter of her mother's murderer. In face of such complete moral certainty, even Pike's brutality wavered. "She won't do it," he said, but voice carried less conviction. "Won't I?" Abby replied. "You killed Mama. Tried to steal me from people who care. Poisoned our river and made children work like slaves. What you think I got to live for if you win?" Fuse continued burning now, less than 20 seconds from end. In hellish light of muzzle flashes and torch flames, everyone could see death approaching with mathematical precision. That was when Barlo Creed made last decision of his life. Instead of surrendering or continuing fight, he broke from cover and ran toward Abby with arms outstretched, screaming something about saving his daughter and protecting his legacy. Whether he meant to grab dynamite or grab the girl was never clear, but his action forced final crisis nobody had wanted. Makya's rifle spoke one last time, and Creed stumbled and fell, clutching chest where heavy bullet had found its mark. But momentum carried him forward, and he crashed into Abby just as she released dynamite stick. The explosive bounced across stone floor fuse, burning down to final seconds. Everyone in chamber dove for whatever cover they could find, while Abby scrambled away from Creed's dying grasp. The explosion, when it came, was devastating, but contained. Instead of bringing down entire chamber, it collapsed only section where dynamite had landed, sealing tunnel entrance Pike had been using for cover, and trapping mine foremen behind tons of fallen stone. Pike's screams echoed briefly from behind rockfall, then stopped abrupt as remaining air in his improvised tomb ran out. In sudden silence that followed, broken only by settling of disturbed earth and drip of underground water, survivors assessed damage. Creed was dead. Pike was buried, and remaining members of conspiracy were either trapped or fleeing through tunnels that led nowhere good. "Everyone breathing," Cole called out. "We're alive," Mary replied, helping Abby to her feet and checking for injuries. Scared, but breathing. Makya emerged from behind his ore sacks, wounded shoulder, now openly bleeding, but rifle still ready for further trouble. "It's finished," he said with quiet satisfaction. But Abby Hart had one more surprise for adults who'd been fighting to protect her. She reached into her coat and produced another document from her mother's hidden papers, one that would change everything they thought they knew about Ruth Hart's relationship with Barlo Creed. "There's something else," she said quiet-like. "Something Mama wanted people to know if anything happened to her." The document Abby handed to Marshal Cole was written in Ruth Hart's careful script, dated just 3 days before her death. It was a detailed confession describing years of harassment, extortion, and threats from Barlo Creed, who had become obsessed with the idea that paying for Abby's support gave him ownership rights over both mother and child. But more shocking than the harassment was Ruth's revelation about how she'd fought back. The water rights to Knife River hadn't been inherited from her father. She'd won them in a poker game from a drunken territorial official who'd been trying to impress her with tales of his importance. When Creed had threatened to take Abby away, Ruth had researched the legal standing of her unexpected windfall and discovered she possessed power to destroy his entire mining operation. Her mistake had been confronting him, direct demanding he leave them alone or face consequences of having water access revoked. Creed's response had been to have Sheriff Doyle murder her before she could carry out her threat. "She was protecting me right to the end," Abby said, simple-like, fighting back the only way she knew how. As they made their way out of the mine through passages that hadn't been blocked by cave-ins, the full scope of the conspiracy's collapse became apparent. Sheriff Doyle and 3 deputies were dead crushed in tunnel collapse Abby had engineered. Remaining corrupt officials were either fleeing territory or preparing to cooperate with federal investigators in hopes of avoiding the gallows. When they finally emerged into cold Dakota dawn, Willow Springs looked different somehow. Smaller, less threatening, like a wild animal revealed to be nothing more than mangy dog with loud bark. The reign of Barlo Creed was over his empire, built on corruption and violence, finally brought down by courage of a 10-year-old girl who refused to be intimidated by men who confused wealth with worth and power with righteousness. But the real victory wasn't just in the destruction of Creed's criminal organization. It was in what would be built in its place. Over the following months, federal investigators would root out corruption that had infected every aspect of territorial government, while honest citizens stepped forward to rebuild their community on foundation of law, rather than personal influence and paid intimidation. The Shaw Home for Foundlings was closed, and its corrupt administrators prosecuted. Children who'd been trapped in that system were placed with real families throughout territory, families who wanted to provide love and care, rather than exploit young hands for profitable work. Judge Morrison, revealed to be uncle of Abby's real father, took personal interest in ensuring the girl received finest education available in territory. A private tutor came 3 days weekly from Deadwood, while Abby spent remaining days helping Mary with the boarding house and learning practical skills from Makya about the natural world surrounding their mountain valley. Mary's new boarding house was larger and more comfortable than her previous establishment, built with insurance money from the fire and a loan from Territorial Development Fund. She ran it with Makya's help, whose wounded shoulder had healed enough to allow work as guide and protector for increasing number of business travelers who came to negotiate with Territory's youngest property owner. At the center of transformation was Abby herself, growing toward adolescence. With combination of her mother's moral strength and shrewd understanding of business that impressed even hardened territorial politicians. Legal proceedings had confirmed her ownership of Knife River water rights, making her one of most powerful landowners in Dakota Territory despite her youth. But Abby wielded that power with wisdom beyond her years. Instead of extracting maximum profit from desperate mining companies, she established environmental standards protecting river while allowing sustainable development. Companies wanting water access had to agree to fair wages for workers' safe conditions and restoration of land damaged by previous operations. On the first anniversary of Ruth Hart's death, 3 people who had become family through choice rather than blood made their way to the cemetery where it had all begun. Ruth's grave now bore proper headstone, carved from Black Hills granite, paid for by her daughter and inscribed with words capturing the essence of woman who died defending what mattered most. Ruth Hart, the stone read in elegant script. Beloved mother, she worked with her hands, loved with her heart, and died protecting her child's future. Her courage lives on in those she saved. Abby placed fresh flowers on the grave, not wilted wildflowers, a frightened child, but carefully arranged bouquet, speaking of prosperity and security her mother had never lived to see. The flowers were expensive roses from Denver greenhouse, but also wildflowers Abby had picked from meadows beside the now clean Knife River. I did it, Mama, she said quiet-like, kneeling beside headstone while Mary and Makya stood respectfully nearby. I'm safe now, and the bad men can't hurt anyone else the way they hurt you. River's getting cleaner every month, and children in this territory are learning to read instead of just working in mines and laundries. She paused, listening to wind whisper through cottonwood trees that had grown taller in the years since her mother's death. I still miss you something fierce, but I understand now why you did what you did. Family ain't just blood. It's people who choose to love each other and protect each other, even when it costs them everything. Mary wiped tears as she listened to the girl who'd brought meaning to her life in ways she'd never expected. After losing her husband in war, she'd thought her chance for family was finished. But Abby had taught her that love could take many forms, and bonds forged in hardship were often stronger than those created by accident of birth. Makya stood with hand resting on his healed shoulder, remembering the son he'd lost and how that grief had been transformed into purpose through protecting this remarkable child. He'd found redemption in her courage and hope, in her determination to make the world better than she'd found it. As they prepared to leave cemetery, Abby picked up one last item from beside her mother's grave, the dented tin cup that had held her birthday cornbread on that terrible night when everything changed. She'd kept it all these months as reminder of what she'd lost, but also of what she'd gained through sacrifices others had made on her behalf. "What you fixing to do with that?" Mary asked gentle-like. "Keep it," Abby replied. "But not as something sad. As something that reminds me, even when worse things happen, there are always good people willing to help if you're brave enough to accept it." They walked back toward town as afternoon sun painted Dakota sky in shades of gold and crimson, leaving graves of past behind while facing future built on foundation Ruth Hart had died to secure. It was future where justice mattered more than profit, where families could be formed from love rather than law, and where a young girl could grow up safe, knowing adults in her life would protect her from any darkness that might threaten to return. The corrupt empire of Barlo Creed had been replaced by something infinitely more valuable: community, where people looked out for each other not because they were paid to, but because it was right thing to do. In her final act of courage, Ruth Hart had saved more than just her daughter. She had saved entire town's soul, and her legacy would live on in lives of everyone who chose justice over profit, love over power, and hope over despair. As sun set over Willow Springs on that anniversary evening, the story of corruption and murder had ended with justice served and innocence protected. But story of Abigail Hart's life was just beginning, and it would be written in light rather than shadow, shaped by love of those who'd chosen to become her family when worlds seemed determined to take away everything she'd ever known. The tin cup in her hands caught last rays of sunlight, no longer symbol of loss and grief, but reminder that even in darkest moments, hope could survive if people were willing to fight for it. And sometimes that was enough to change the world.